You glance at your car's dashboard. 300 horsepower, it reads. You've never questioned that number. It feels arbitrary, industrial, a leftover unit from some forgotten engineer. The term actually comes from the 18th century, from an engineer named James Watt, who needed a way to sell his new steam engines to people who had no concept of power except the one animal they relied on every single day. But that number is a fossil, a linguistic fossil of the single most transformative animal partnership in human history. For 99% of human history, there were no horses in your life at all. Not as transport, not as power, not as anything you could ride or harness. For 99% of human history, horses were prey. Fast, dangerous, hunted on foot, with spears, with patience, with groups of starving humans working in coordination just to bring one down. Then something happened on the steppes of Central Asia, in a landscape of open grass and brutal winters. And it changed the trajectory of our species more than fire, more than agriculture, more than almost anything else we ever touched. Around 3,500 BCE, in what is now northern Kazakhstan, a community called the Botai began doing something no human group had done before. Archaeologist Alan Outram and his team found the evidence buried in bone fragments and pottery residue, traces of mare's milk fat, baked into clay shards 5,000 years old. Someone was milking horses. Someone had stopped hunting them and started living alongside them. There is more direct evidence than milk residue. Outram's later research examined the teeth of Botai horses themselves and found a specific pattern of wear on the premolars, consistent with a bit being held in the mouth for sustained periods. Not a single horse. Multiple horses. A pattern, not an accident. Now some of you are thinking, fine, so humans domesticated horses, just like dogs, just like cattle. End of story. It is not the end of the story. It is barely the beginning. Here's the part that stops most people. Genetic research led by paleogeneticist Ludovic Orlando found something strange when his team sequenced ancient horse DNA across thousands of years and hundreds of specimens. The Botai horses, the ones first milked and possibly ridden, are not the ancestors of modern domestic horses. They died out. Replaced. Almost every horse alive today traces back to a single population that exploded out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe around 2200 BCE, spreading across Europe and Asia in barely a few centuries. A few centuries. For an animal, on foot, before trains, before roads. That speed only makes sense with riding, with trade networks, with humans actively moving this specific bloodline across an entire continent because it offered something extraordinary. And here's the question nobody asks out loud. What if the horse was not simply absorbed into human life the way a dog was? What if the horse, once tamed, began reshaping human life from the inside out? Consider two groups living in 3000 BCE. The first, a settled farming community, walking distance defining their entire world. A trip to the next valley takes a day. News travels as fast as a person can walk it. A stranger arriving from 3 valleys over is treated as a rare event, almost a small miracle. Marriage, trade, war, all bounded by the radius of 2 human legs. The second group has horses. Their radius is not measured in days anymore. It's measured in weeks of territory, covered in hours. Anthropologist David Anthony, who spent decades studying the Pontic-Caspian steppe, argues that horseback riding didn't just speed up travel. It restructured economy, kinship, and war into something almost unrecognizable to the walking world next door. Suddenly, herding huge flocks across vast grasslands became possible for a handful of people instead of an entire village. Suddenly, raiding a settlement 100 miles away and returning home before anyone could organize a defense became possible. Suddenly, a small group of mounted warriors could outmaneuver, outrun, and overwhelm communities 10 times their size. The horse did not adapt to fit into existing human society. Human society bent itself around the horse. Look at language. Most researchers now agree that the spread of Indo-European languages, the linguistic ancestor of English, Russian, Hindi, Persian, and dozens of others spoken by nearly half the planet today, tracks almost perfectly with the migration of horse-riding pastoralist groups out of the steppe. Not armies with maps and conquest plans. Herders, riders. People who moved because the horse let them move, and who took their words, their gods, and their genes with them. Some estimates suggest that close to 40% of the DNA in many modern European populations traces back to this single migration wave, a wave that simply would not have been geographically possible on foot. Even the vocabulary of power and class carries the fingerprints of this animal. The word cavalry comes from the Latin cabalus, meaning horse. The word chivalry comes from the French cheval, horse. The very idea of a noble class, an elite worth admiring, was, for most of recorded history, simply a polite way of saying, the people who could afford to ride. Look at how these societies buried their dead. Across the steppe, archaeologists keep finding kurgans, earthen burial mounds, where elite men were laid to rest beside the skeletons of sacrificed horses. Not food offerings, not livestock. Companions, buried in death the way you would bury a partner. Status itself, in these cultures, had become inseparable from the animal you rode. Now picture the bodies of the riders themselves. Skeletal studies of steppe populations show changes in hip sockets, in spine curvature, in the wear patterns on thigh bones, physical adaptations consistent with a lifetime spent on horseback, beginning sometimes in early childhood. Humans were not just changing their tools. Their skeletons were quietly rewriting themselves around an animal. Compare that to the dog. The dog adapted its behavior, its diet, even its skull shape, to fit into human society. The dog became smaller, friendlier, dependent. The horse did something almost the reverse. It stayed large, stayed strong, stayed essentially wild in temperament, and instead it was humans who restructured their settlements, their economies, their wars, their words, and even their bones around the horse's existence. By 2000 BCE, chariots pulled by paired horses were transforming warfare across the Near East and Central Asia, evidence found at sites like Sintashta in the southern Urals. Within a few more centuries, mounted cavalry made entire infantry-based empires obsolete overnight. Power itself, the ability to conquer, to trade, to survive, became inseparable from access to horses. This pattern did not stay buried in the Bronze Age. It repeated itself, almost identically, thousands of years later. When horses returned to the Great Plains of North America in the 1600s, the Comanche transformed within a few generations from a small foraging group into the dominant power of an entire region, controlling trade routes and holding empires at bay on horseback. Genghis Khan's armies, centuries earlier, conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome conquered in 400, riding the same basic biological partnership that began on the steppe with the Botai. Different centuries, different continents, the same animal, rewriting the same kind of outcome. So when you say a car has 300 horsepower, you are not casually referencing some quaint old farm animal. You're admitting that this entire species, your species, built its languages, its bloodlines, its wars, and its bodies around a creature it once only knew as something to fear and to hunt. We like the story where humans tame nature, where we bend wild things to our will and walk away the masters of the process. It is a comfortable story. It puts us at the center, in control, the species that conquers everything it touches. The horse tells a quieter, stranger story, one where taming went both directions at once, and where the species doing the taming ended up changed just as deeply as the one being tamed. Next time you start the engine and that number flashes on the dashboard, remember what it's really counting. Not horsepower. Memory. The ghost of an animal that walked out of the steppe 5,000 years ago looked at a hungry, walking, slow-moving species and quietly rewrote what that species could become, and never let us go back to who we were before it arrived.